Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest in Eno's webinar series. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm the Policy Director here at the Eno Center for Transportation, and very excited to talk today about the role of technology in modernizing our supply chains. As we all know, the freight sector has long been a leader in innovating and leveraging new technologies and ways to improve operational speed, efficiency, safety. And that's all the more important now with COVID upending supply chains, with a historic increase in safety-related incidents that's trending in the wrong direction, and issues attracting workforce to some of the supply chain critical positions. So in this webinar, we're going to hear from some folks that know a lot about the supply chain and about the different main transportation components of it. And we're going to talk about new technologies and strategies that are happening in the field, both the opportunities to them and the policy barriers that they're facing. So we're super excited to have three folks on the call today. We have Cary Davis, who is Vice President of Government Relations and General Counsel at the American Association of Port Authorities. We have Kari Gonzales, who is the President and CEO of MXV Rail. And we have Kevin Grove, who is the Director of Safety and Technology Policy at the American Trucking Associations. So three different components of the supply chain, the transportation aspects of the supply chain. And I'm going to start some questions here in just a moment. Two quick housekeeping notes. I'm going to have a conversation. I have some questions for them that I'm going to use moderator's prerogative on here. And after that, we're going to go to the questions from the audience. So those of you that are on the live stream, there is a questions button at the bottom of your browser. You can use that to put a question in, and I'll be able to take a look at that and then ask that to the panel or a panelist, depending on what the question is. So please use that questions function. And then if you're having any technical difficulties, the best thing to do is to close your browser and restart it. That seems to work on most technical issues. And if you're having continued problems, you can use the chat function to talk to, or the help function, the help function at the bottom of your screen to help some of the staff here at Eno can make sure that your technical issues are being resolved. And so with that, we're going to launch into the conversation. And we're gonna talk about what's new in the freight industry. For each of your particular parts of the freight sectors, what are, in your opinion, some of the top new things that are changing freight efficiency, freight safety, and the dynamics of our system? And we're going to start with Cary Davis, and then we're going to hear from Kari Gonzales, and then we'll go to Kevin after that. So, Kari, can you kick us off?
Paul, is my audio okay?
Yes, we can hear you loud.
Great. So thank you to you and all of your colleagues at Eno and Eno itself for hosting this. I'll call ourselves out, unlike a lot of the issues in the freight system and global supply chains, you run a very tight ship here. And I know I have to limit my remarks to just a few minutes, so I'm going to do that. I'm a little bit of an old soul, so I want to set us up where we're at in history in maritime shipping, talk about your question, which is what specifics are happening now, and then talk about the future. The history is that there have been three technological breakthrough periods in ocean shipping. One was the steamship in the 19th century. Then there was containerization in the 1960s and 70s. I'm mostly literally talking about the metal boxes, but it refers to other standards like for vessel design. And now we are at the third technological breakthrough in maritime shipping, which is digitization and data across the supply chain. So we're trying to get better data to track not only the goods that are moving across the supply chain, but also to use that data or to digitalize the system, which means data-driven equipment deployment decisions, the ability to peer around corners and know what trends are coming for the next emergency, and to be able to stretch and surge to handle, say, a cargo surge like the one we've just happened, to identify where in the supply chain we can decarbonize certain practices, and using data to determine where the biggest ROI is for decarbonization, And also, digital transparency means more consumer choices and better service, which is kind of what we're being pushed to provide to the users of the system. So a couple more specifics about what's happening now. Well, the feds are definitely looking into inducing or incentivizing more of the digitization that I was just talking about. There are two big initiatives underway. We might talk about them during the Q&A, but just so you have the names, one is called the Flow Initiative, and one is called the Maritime Transport Data Initiative. These are two federal government related initiatives. You can Google them right away and see a lot of stuff, or we could talk about it during the Q&A. What other improvements are happening now in the system? Well, there's been a big infusion of federal infrastructure money. Most everyone's heard of the bipartisan infrastructure law and these other big congressional spending bills, Biden priorities for infrastructure. So we're reinvigorating aged infrastructure. We're expanding the capacity. We're building up, literally, port complexes are hard on the water and there's not a lot of room to expand. So you literally start building up warehouses that go up. You get the idea. Newer equipment at the ports, which include plug-in equipment, connected equipment. And just as a paradigm, we're investing in our freight system like it's an integrated multimodal system. So choke points happen from one handoff spot to the next. We try not to invest in silos or bridges to nowhere. We invest in a multimodal system. Surely my other panelists will talk a little bit about this stuff. Other infrastructure, I'm moving into the last part of my comments here, but the other infrastructure at ports, it's not just docks, pilings, and piers, it's devices, data, and infotech, like I was talking about before. So some of the sexier tech is, if you're really a nerd about this stuff, is ocean and waterway mapping technology. So that allows for more efficient dredging and navigation decisions in and around the ports. Advanced construction materials that hold up better to extreme weather and natural disasters, and there's less carbon output during the life cycle of the production and usage of those materials. Next generation bunkering, which is just a term of art. It means how we fuel the ships. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. And then there are other sorts of tech deployment like air quality measuring devices, carbon capture devices at the ports to capture some of the carbon output from the vessels. So I mentioned the bunkering or the fueling of ships. This is my last point here before I turn it over. It could easily cost $1 trillion to decarbonize the ocean shipping industry. That is to get all of the vessels in the industry off of the heavy diesel, very, very dirty bunker fuel or ship fueling fuel. But everyone agrees, and it's well underway, that we need to decarbonize the fleets of these ships that are moving 90% of everything around me, around us today. 90% of it moves on one of these ships. We have to decarbonize the system. So what does the future look like? 10 to 20% of all of the vessels being built right now, it's a 2 or 3 year lag time to build them. 10 to 20% are going to be fueled by LNG, which eliminates nearly all respiratory emissions in and around ports. Ocean carrier Maersk, which is a name that most everyone will recognize, they have 12 container ships on order to run on green methanol. We can talk more about that. And my very last point is kind of an ironic one, and it's back to the future. One very well-established ocean carrier is building a vessel that will be partially powered by advanced sails. Yes, sails, like wind sails. That's going to reduce emissions by about 90% compared to the way most ships are fueled now. So we kind of come full circle back to the future, back to the 1800s and wind-powered ships. So thank you very much.
Wow, thanks, Kari. That very exciting stuff. Cool. Some things I hadn't been quite aware of, and of course, only on an Eno Freight webinar do we mention the word sexy and dredging in the same sentence. So I think a lot of the folks on the call may agree with that too. That's pretty cool stuff. All right, Kari, let's shift modes a little bit and go over to what's happening on the railroads.
All right. Well, it's a great appreciation to hear that the shipping industry is, kind of going back to their roots, because as many of you know, railroads are one of the nation's oldest industries. But being that we're one of the oldest industries, we still continue to embrace technology and innovation to help evolve and compete in the transportation world. So there are a few specifics that I will get to in a minute, but at the high level, I think it's really important to stress that railroads are continually looking for opportunities to introduce technology to enhance safety, reliability, and efficiency. As you noted in the advance of this event, we really are in a difficult time. And even if supply chain congestion has abated some of those issues, the labor market still really remains strained, and how people view and work, it's going to continue to change. So I think it's important that we're having these discussions about the future of the supply chain and the modernization within each of the elements. Technology on the railroad part, we really think it can work in concert with our highly skilled and trained and well-compensated workforce. We look at things like drones, automated track inspection systems, detection systems that are along the entirety of the network that are looking for flaws in rolling stock, and systems like what we would call trip optimizer, which really enhances the fuel efficiency of the network in its entirety. Really, railroad employees are the ones that are utilizing that technology to help improve the performance of the system at large. Long term, we see this as a net positive for rail customers and, by extension, the U.S. economy. And we look at, historically some of the things that have been achieved that have really benefited the economy. One of those systems that we always mention is positive train control, or PTC. This is a GPS-based system that helps to prevent the worst types of accidents. It was fully implemented in 2020 after some work with the Federal Railroad Administration, and we really believe that we're seeing fruits of that system already. But more importantly, the industry views this system as one that can be layered onto to help accelerate automation. So although we implemented the foundation early on, we're really being able to leverage that foundation to continue to move the industry forward. Net impact of that is safer operations and potentially increasing the capacity on our network without having to physically add more infrastructure, which continually is a challenge for, in the entirety of the U.S. Some additional technologies that I think are really interesting and what I would call more on the disruptive front include companies like Parallel Systems, really looking at introducing new technology that's really benefiting in the ports and being able to make movements more efficiently and put higher utilization on existing infrastructure. I think the last important thing that I just wanted to mention in my opening remarks is, I am the president and CEO of MXV Rail. For those of you that are on the phone that are not really clear of what my organization does, we're formerly TTCI, but really we're I like to call us the research and technology hub of the North American freight rail industry. We really provide insight into all of the up and coming technologies and help ease the implementation process into the rail industry. One of our unique challenges and really opportunities when I look at it from a global perspective is the concept of interchange. Having an organization that is wholly focused on a proving ground for the industry and the technology implementation really helps streamline the technology that's being produced and being implemented into the industry. I think that kind of wraps up the comments that I have for right now. I'm sure that there's a lot more questions that are coming, and we're excited to help address any of those that may come.
Excellent. Thank you, Kari. That was really helpful. I've got some notes here and a couple things I want to follow up with. And I've been noticing a few other questions coming in the question bank. Again, folks that have questions on the live webinar, please do submit those. We're going to try to get to as many as we can here once this really gets rolling. But I do want to make sure that Kevin has an opportunity to talk about what's going on in the trucking sector. Kevin, can you give us some insights?
Sure. So, hello, I'm the ATA's Director of Safety and Technology Policy. I do work with a lot of interesting technologies. I think a lot of what's happening in the trucking industry you'd actually be familiar with on the light vehicle side. Things like automation and electric vehicles, except when we're talking about the trucking industry, we need to make sure that we're talking about business cases that make sense. So things that have return on investment, things that are equal or better in safety, things that aren't going to have unintended consequences on your vehicle's utilization or your uptime. And there's a lot of, I think, questions right now about how that can be deployed in a way that's going to make business sense and make our transit networks more resilient. So I guess I'll start on the automation side. in my previous life, I actually did a lot of work with driver assistance automation, not necessarily driverless automation. There's been a lot of really big advances in driver assistance systems. Some of them are about to become standard next year because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Automatic emergency braking is going to be available on every truck. And that is coming with a whole suite of other technologies. And it's really the combination of these different technologies as we see them getting more deployed in our industry, and the vast treasure troves of data that come off of these that fleets are learning how to utilize and learning how to really improve their operations and train their drivers better, coach their drivers better, and really get a lot better safety outcomes by combining the technologies and using the data that comes off of them. But on top of that, we have the whole other world of driverless automation, and it is being tested heavily in the US. There are a number of companies that are out there running trucks right now with drivers in the driver's seat as a backup, but essentially hands-off wheel testing on our roads. And they're learning a lot of valuable lessons, and generally it's going to be coming sooner than people think. But the question is not necessarily when it's going to come, it's where it's going to come. It's going to come in places where there is a need for additional capacity on our transit network. It's where we need more drivers, or in the long haul sector where it's difficult to recruit drivers to drive those long distances, or where our hours of service rules are making certain trips difficult to make with one single 14-hour block. So I think there's going to be some real interesting use cases for driverless automation coming in the future. And we're seeing a lot of interesting developments now. We just have a new inspection protocol that can be used for driverless vehicles to help them bypass the difficult situation of roadside inspections. They can perform an enhanced inspection now in order to get a higher level of safety assurance before they leave for their trip, and then they can proceed along without having to get pulled over by roadside in order to make those operations more efficient. So there's a lot of cool developments in automation. Some of whether or not you see it on the road near you depends on where you live, but in some of the heavy freight corridors where there's a lot of capacity need, you can go out on the highway and you can see them driving around right now. On the electric vehicle side, it's very interesting. There are very good, and not just electric vehicles, also alternative fuels like LNG that was mentioned earlier. Those are all being heavily explored in the trucking industry. And there's a lot of interesting use cases for electric vehicles and even the intersection of electric vehicles and automation. But there's a lot of questions still about the maintenance, making sure that they have the proper uptime, the charging infrastructure. There hasn't been a lot of incentives in the bipartisan infrastructure bill for commercial vehicle electrification. A lot of commercial operations want to be able to control their charging needs so they can make sure their operations are going to be satisfied. They want to build that behind the fence so they can guarantee the usage of it. We haven't seen the incentives for that quite yet, but we're working to try to figure out how that can be built into the incentives that are being put out there for alternative fuels and clean energy.
Excellent. Really, really good. You are preemptively answering some questions I see coming into the question box, which is really helpful. You all talked about data. We talked about workforce and automation and resilience. I want to talk on each one of those subjects, but the data one will start because that was something that each one of you mentioned, is that there's going to be a wealth of data. And Kari, you in particular kind of highlighted some of the potential uses for that. A question I have that kind of gets us into the little bit of the policy sphere is when or who is owning that data, right? And how do we kind of balance between government ownership, private sector ownership? We can think of infinite uses for it, but that ownership is going to really determine how it can be used, particularly by the public sector. So let's go Kari and then and Kevin to talk about a little bit about how that data piece fits in.
Wonderful question. I'll try to tackle the tough one about who owns or who should own or who should be compelled to give up information or ownership of the data. The pretty easy and straightforward answer is what we in the industry call beneficial cargo owners, or BCOs, the people who are at the end of the day the owners of the goods that are being moved through the system. They own the data about their cargo. In many cases, they may not realize how that data, those data are being aggregated for different reasons. But so the easy way to think about this is that the cargo owners own the data about their cargoes. That might seem silly and straightforward, but it does lead to, if we want to move towards some sort of reliable, standardized, transparent, holistic supply chain data system, cargo owners are probably going to have to give up ownership rights in their data. In some cases, they're doing that through their freight contracts. But there is a two-way street here. The outrage that we, in many cases justified, the outrage that we hear from the shipping community, the cargo owning community, is, wow, when I go to the airport, I pretty much know where my baggage is at all times. Well, that's because you're signing away your rights to data protections when you buy an airline ticket. It's going to have to be the same. The signing over of those data rights are going to have to be built into freight contracts. Of course, it could come from the opposite direction. The government could, and it's moving towards, mandating more data sharing by the transport providers, i.e. the ocean carriers, the marine terminal operators, the ports, the rail, the truck, in which case everyone's forced to share data. That comes with its own pitfalls. And hope I'm not using too much jargon here, but that's kind of the straightforward answer to your good question.
Yeah, and I think on the trucking side, generally we're seeing similar relationships around ownership. It can be case by case, but generally fleets own the data, although because of legal liability, sometimes a fleet may want to keep some data at arm's length, because if they have that data, and then they may be responsible for using that data. And even when a fleet owns the data, that doesn't necessarily mean they've got this constant stream that's coming in. A lot of the times, the technology providers will also help you filter that data, or help you figure out what you need to look at. So for example, if it's video data, like an event recorder, they may take the first pass at filtering that and then providing you with coachable events based on the data that's coming in, even if you own the data. So I think in general, the fleets have ownership of it, but there are a lot of different directions data is flying at them, and they don't necessarily have a good way to unify all that data, whether it's ELD data or event recorder data or vehicle network data. Having a unified platform or a way to visualize all that data together would be really helpful. And I think generally only the larger fleets kind of have the level of IT sophistication to really do that. They have enough resources that they can work through their own sort of dashboards to work with the data. But I think for smaller fleets, it's really about partnering with the suppliers to help them learn what they need to get out of that information.
Yeah, and I think I would add on to, from the rail side, there's different tiers of data ownership and visibility. It depends on what you're looking at, whether you're looking at the end-to-end from, a rail car traveling across the nation, where is that rail car? That data is a bit more visible to the consumer and the shipper. But when we look at safety perspective, a lot of that is generated through the individual railroads and then filtered up into an industry-wide system that helps us make good safety decisions. One particular one that I think has been an outstanding story in terms of safety and reliability across all railroads is hot bearing detection. Hot bearing detection systems are monitoring the temperature of a bearing as a rail car is passing by the inspection system. 15 years ago, those were placed strategically across the U.S., but looked at very independently. So it resulted in a lot of stops on trains or potentially some missed applications. About 5 or 8 years ago, it's been a while, but when we moved to a more connected network where we're taking all of the data and starting to apply some predictive analytics to those detectors, we were really able to have a better idea of how far we can push how far in advance we were starting to predict any of these failures and removing them from service in a time frame that was acceptable to the industry and improve the safety. So not only were you getting safety improvements by sharing data, you were also getting better improvements in reliability through the network. So I would say that's kind of the different layers that we're experiencing in the rail industry and how we're working together and leveraging different data sets to make good business decisions. But then on the flip side, you're still looking at other technologies that are being introduced by shippers to have better insight as their freight and cargo is moving across the country. So we have a little bit of both, but I think both are very, very important from a visibility and reliability perspective.
That's great. Just based on some of the questions coming in, I feel like we could have a whole webinar focused just on data policy for the freight sector. So I'm going to move on to a different topic, not because I feel like we've exhausted that question, but because we want to talk a little bit broadly. And there was a bunch of questions that came up talking about automation and the workforce. And I know that this is something that kind of has a little bit of two sides, right? In many cases, automation can help a driver or other worker do their job, and in other cases, there's a threat to a job. I wanted to see if anyone has any thoughts about how we address particularly the latter, and we think about good public policies and strategies to help implement technology such as automation that also helps support the workforce. No, Kevin, would it be okay to pick on you to launch that one? You talked about automation a lot.
Sure, I'll jump in front of that bullet. So I think I can actually address this with another question that we got. For the foreseeable future, I don't think automation is going to be level 5, where it can handle all situations and all use cases. It's going to have a limited operational design domain. And again, those are going to be built out based on demand, where there is a need for additional trucking capacity, and also other things like weather conditions that are acclimated to automation and other factors. One, I think, use case that is really being focused on in trucking is kind of the hub-to-hub model, where you can set up a hub along the highway or along the existing ODD, where the enhanced inspections can get done, the maintenance can get done, all the other things that are going to be very focused around automation. And then you're going to have human drivers handling more of the local and regional routes. That's not the only case. For example, at ports, there's a lot of use cases on private property and closed sort of space automation as well. But that's the one that I think a lot of developers are working towards, is that hub-to-hub model. Doesn't mean it can't expand past that in the future, but that's where most of the testing is really being focused. And I think there's going to be a future where the human drivers are really integrating with the automation to kind of reconfigure how routes are run, so that the automation can handle the long haul situations, running 25 hours across the country, whereas normally a human would be limited to 14. And then having human drivers with this expanding network of hub to hubs, kind of handling much more of a regional sort of operation. And the hope is that the quality of life would improve, that you can get the drivers back home more frequently with more regular schedules. But that all depends on exactly how this automation deployment goes. So that's one potential outcome. I'm not clairvoyant enough to say that is the outcome, but I think that is the one that is currently kind of being aimed for, and one that hopefully would make everything sort of feasible for everyone involved in the process.
Kari, do you want to take another stab at that question from the railroad perspective? And I know that you talked a lot about automation, and there's, I think, some similar paradigms to the comments that Kevin just made in the railroad sector.
Certainly, we are looking at automation, not only in the cabs, but also along the wayside. And I think the most important element is that the technologies that we're looking at are really enhancements to current operating procedures. One in particular that we look at is in the automatic automated track inspection. I know this has been around a lot in the news right now, and we really think from a technology standpoint that the data has demonstrated undeniably that it improves the overall safety of our industry. We've worked with the FRA to get some extensions and expansions of waivers for some pilot programs, which we feel like is doing our due diligence, right? We're not just throwing this technology out, we're really taking steps to ensure that what we say we're going to do is actually happening, and both the safety benefits and other benefits are actually being achieved. And so at this point, we had some early cooperation with the FRA. We struggled a little bit to get additional waivers in place, but we really do think that if we want to see the improvements in safety with minimal impacts on the workforce, because the manual inspections are still required, technologies like this really need to start progressing through the regulatory environment a lot quicker.
Great. Kari, anything from the port sector you want to add on this one?
I love hearing from engineers and technologists talk about this stuff, like Kevin and Kari. I'm just kind of that stick in the mud lawyer type. And I hate to say it, but I've got to dodge this one completely. Most folks here will know that the port industry, not unlike what somewhat similar, somewhat different than what the rail industry is going through. But we're deep in the throes of a labor contract negotiation affecting about 22,000 longshore workers on the West Coast. So anything I say wouldn't help that process. And so I've got to avoid it, because we want a resolution to it so that we can keep our supply chains fluid.
Totally understand, and it's an important but it's a challenging topic, but important to talk about. So thanks for your thoughts on that. I want to shift gears a little bit because I think two of you brought up the bipartisan infrastructure law, or IIJA. A lot of money flowing out for concrete and steel to help revitalize and invest in our systems. A lot of that is for concrete and steel, but some of it is also for technology or different ways of putting that infrastructure down. Can you just talk a little bit about and Kari, maybe I'll talk with you, and just given that I think the port sector was a big winner in terms of a lot of new funding. What new approaches are eligible, and how does it fit into this broader discussion about modernizing our supply chains using new approaches and innovative technology?
So that's a wonderful question, Paul. And you're right. I'd say the ports were less. See, here's where you can see I'm not just a stick in the mud lawyer. I'm also a policy advocate. The ports weren't just winners. All Americans were winners because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And yes, vis-a-vis investments in our ports, the ports are taking nearly $5.5 billion for various infrastructure investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And to answer the question head on, it's just about every facet of port infrastructure that benefits from this. It's the water side dredging and navigation channels. It's the berths and the docks and the pilings and the piers. It's the land side warehousing and cargo moving equipment. It's the intermodal connectors, including the on-dock rail and the truck queuing spaces. So as you can see, it's every facet of the port complex that had an infusion of investment money. There's one little quandary, though, that I want to hone in on, which is there is an aspect of federal infrastructure money called Buy American. And it basically is a procurement preference for American-made stuff when you're using federal money for infrastructure. What's the quandary? Many of the most modern cargo moving equipment like cranes and top pickers and rubber tire gantries. I mean, these are different types of equipment, but you can picture them. You drive past the port, you see these giant ship-to-shore cranes. They're not made in America. They haven't been for a generation. The last time those types of cranes were made in America, they looked nothing like it. They looked like a crane in your backyard. So we've got to convince the government for a short period of time to allow us to get the best modern electrified hybrid faster equipment from our allies, and hopefully we can reshore the manufacture of that equipment using some of the infrastructure monies to do so.
Very good. Kevin, I'm going to go to you next, talking about opportunities in IAJA. What is the trucking industry really focused on now?
Well, they were looking to find some help with the alternative fuels and the battery electric zero emission style of infrastructure. The trucking industry is facing some new regulations, some from the EPA regarding low NOx. I think that might actually reference Cary's LNG comments. The other side is going to be California and CARB. So there are tough regulations coming that, especially if your trucks go through California, they're going to need to comply with. And I think the hope was finding some incentives to build out the infrastructure that would be needed to adopt more easily these zero emission vehicles or alternative fuels that are going to comply with these new regulations. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case quite yet. And I do think reasonably the people behind the bipartisan infrastructure law want some of the infrastructure that's being built to be shared infrastructure, especially if it's going to be shared with the public, if they're using public funds for it, which makes total sense, but doesn't necessarily fit well with trucking operations. You don't want to have your truck that is scheduled for a delivery waiting behind someone to charge their vehicle. And also, I think when we're talking about truck operations, we're talking about sometimes megawatt style chargers where it's not going to be a back to base over the night style of charging, whereas the more typical level 2 type chargers are going to be a good fit for the public. So there's a little mismatch in the style of infrastructure that we're looking for in commercial operations. And also just, everyone wants their goods yesterday. And, if your truck is going to be charging for 4 hours at a station, that's not going to happen. So that it's just a little bit of an ideological thing that just needs to get resolved. There are plenty of use cases right now where battery electric or other alternative fuels make total sense. But and personally, I do think that the ultimate solution is going to be a little bit of a mix of technologies, because each technology has strengths and weaknesses in different use cases. But that is going to require building out a few parallel infrastructures maybe, or really figuring out where we need and how we need to build some new infrastructure to facilitate all this.
Great. And I'll pitch it over to Kari and Gonzales as well. It's a little bit different for the railroads because the infrastructure is privately owned rather than
Right.
publicly owned. But what opportunities and what is the railroad industry interested in IIJA?
Yeah, so you make an excellent point. Railroads do fund their own infrastructure, so we've really worked less on direct funding opportunities through IIJA. But nonetheless, we do think that the policy is good and useful for growing and decarbonizing the U.S. infrastructure, which I'd like to play off a little bit on that. So we looked at more of the R&D opportunities, and particularly with my organization being geared at looking at research, development, testing of up and coming technologies. So really unlikely places like DOE, we've been starting to engage with quite a bit. The hydrogen hubs are also something that we think are exciting. So we really appreciated the decarbonization element of opportunities in the IIJA and looking to partner with different organizations and frankly, different industry that may be a bit more progressive on that side to figure out how we could apply that technology to the rail industry.
That's great. So I'm looking at the time here. We've got about 6 minutes left in our time slot, and I want to make sure we talk about barriers. We've been spending a lot of time talking about opportunities, and that's very exciting. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on. There's a lot of new policies that are, I think, supportive. But I want to talk about where you all are seeing some pinch points. Where are there government regulations or other technological barriers that are kind of keeping us back from adopting these whole scale? And maybe we can go in that same order of Cary Davis, Kari Gonzales, and Kevin Grove again, just to talk through what some of those barriers are.
So thanks for the question. It's a great one, and it gets us thinking, right? It's not easy. I could say a lot about the data sharing barriers that you brought up at the beginning, Paul, but you can also kind of tell I have a little bit of a back to the future theme about me. So one of the biggest barriers that we talk about a lot, that the ports don't have a uniform position on, but we talk about a lot, is expanding the hours of operation of our supply chain, right? While we're not like a 9 to 5 industry, we don't work round the clock, whereas in a lot of other major international trading nations, they do, especially net exporting nations. So maybe we could help clear a lot of backlogs of ships queuing at ports or containers piling up at rail yards or congested highways by having our supply chain work deep into the night. I certainly don't want large, obnoxious vehicles rattling around my neighborhood at 4 a.m. when I wake up, actually. However, I do wake up and I see the electric Amazon delivery trucks that are out, and they pull up basically silently to my condo building, and they're making deliveries into the big machine where you put everyone's packages. And they're doing that deep into the night, and that's one less truck that has to be on the road during congested hours. So what is the barrier? All players in the supply chain have to operate 24/7 or have to operate expanded hours at the same time. That's what I was driving at. You can't move cargo off a vessel if the port's not open late hours. You can't move cargo from the port if the rail, on dock rail isn't open expanded hours. If the warehousing is not open 24 hours, you get the idea here. All players in the chain have to be open expanded hours to ultimately expand the hours of operation of our supply chain.
Got it. Well, if you're getting up at 4 a.m., you must have young children in the house.
Just so
I'm a 4 a.m. person too, but that's to work out at 5 a.m. So I'm
giving my
take on this one.
You're better than me. I'm not working out. I'm just working.
There you go. We do think that there is inertia through the regulatory process, and being a highly regulated industry, absent of more performance-based standards, that inertia really is important to us. Which is why one of those pieces that I talked about earlier in the form of waivers and pilot programs, we think can play a major role. More broadly, I would point to something that probably this entire panel shares is public skepticism. Even though we know that technology, while far from perfect, it can really assist in improving outcomes, whether that be human or non-human, but we all have this inherent skepticism about us. So I think there's a really big need for not only the railroads, but the transportation industry as a whole to better articulate the benefits of technology, particularly as it relates to improving safety and bringing more visibility to the work that's done ahead of implementation to ensure that the outcomes are positive. So my push for the people on this panel and the people on this call is really to start working on communication, visibility about the importance of technology, the role that it can play, and how we safely deploy that in each one of our respective industries.
Well, I'm going to steal your ideas because I think they're also very relevant to the trucking industry. On the regulatory side, especially with automation, we really need some guidance coming down from the DOT on the topic. Between NHTSA regulating new vehicles and FMCSA regulating the operations of commercial vehicles, it's been they've put out good guidance, but at some point it's going to have to go into the regulatory space to figure out what actually is compliant with FMVSS when it comes to automation, or what do they need to have to be compliant. Right now, a vehicle's required to have a steering wheel, and you don't need to have a steering wheel in a driverless truck. And then on the FMCSA side, it's going to be about the operation and maintenance of these vehicles to make sure that they're being operated correctly. We do know that even among human-driven vehicles, there's a large number of trucks that have out-of-service violations when they do these big blitzes on roadside checks. So rightly so, FMCSA is going to want to make sure that these vehicles, when they don't have a human who might be able to perceive that something doesn't feel right about the vehicle, we're going to want some assurance that those are not going to happen on an automated vehicle. And I mentioned the enhanced inspection protocol. It's designed to do exactly that, to go above and beyond the requirements for vehicles in order to make sure that while they're in operation, we know they're in good condition. And also the public perception. People are already nervous driving around 18-wheelers. And if you told them that there's no driver in the truck, that's not going to necessarily make them feel better. So that's really going to be coming from all angles of the automotive industry, though. I think your experience with personal vehicles has a lot to say about how you feel about the commercial vehicle side of it. So if you're familiar with automation in the light vehicle space, if you take a ride in a robo-taxi, I think that will actually help your perceptions of what's going on in the commercial vehicle space as well. So maybe we have a slight advantage there, that there's an easier way to experience the automation for people that would interact with traffic and automated vehicles.
Yeah, that's great, and really building off the public skepticism point that Kari just mentioned. So, the interesting thing about this, and kind of watching some of the questions come in, is in my head I've formulated a couple future webinars for us to continue this conversation. Certainly, we need to have a broader conversation about data and data policy. I think there's a lot of thirst. I'm just, again, judging from folks that are tuning in on that issue. Electrification, alternative fuels. I think there's a whole other conversation there that this webinar is certainly seeding. And then automation, right? This is something that automation is something Eno has done a lot of work in over the years, and have I think now all the more reason to kind of reinvigorate that discussion from a policy standpoint to figure out what are those barriers and how might we overcome them. So this has been tremendously helpful and interesting to me. I hope you all learned something on the webinar, and certainly want to thank our panelists for taking the time this afternoon to join us. And again, we'll continue the conversation as we can. So thanks again, everybody. And we hope to see you on our next webinar soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.